Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old Fourth Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
I said it before and I'll say it again. Watching your state legislature do their thing on a YouTube live stream is not usually must-see watching. It's not something you want to bookmark every day. But I have to say, there are moments where you can catch some things, and I get to do it in review because I prepare this show each weekday to air first at 9 a.m. on America One Radio. So that by the time I'm preparing for it, you're not going to get that day's entertainment. But you will get the prior days. And yesterday, as I have featured before, Senator Josh McLaren from the 2nd District, state senator here in the Georgia General Assembly, gives us a little summation of the Trump morning news, as he likes to decipher it for us. Again, it's in a state house. It's in the state Senate here in Georgia. There's nothing that can be done. But I appreciate the fact that he is bringing Trump's antics to the good old boys here and girls in the state of Georgia who not only support Donald Trump, coddled him, put together a state election board seeking to assist him returning to the White House. Never mind the fact that the lieutenant governor, fellow by the name of Burt Jones, something about a fake elector. And anyway, so Burt gets to sit there and listen to this all unfold as well as Senator Josh McLaren gives us the Trump morning news. This was from yesterday.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. I am the senator from the 14th, and this is Trump Morning News. Trump Morning News, your number one leader in Trump news entertainment, keeping you reminded about the health of your democracy. This week in Trump Morning News, continuous personnel actions of unprecedented scope are occurring in the federal government, with the CIA largely receiving, almost all of its members, a resignation offer in commensurate with Elon Musk's federal takeover, in which employees are offered a buyout in exchange for resigning their jobs. Yeah. Some core spies are not affected, which means that Trump intends to keep at least some foreign policy alive.
Some. And I'll have some more on that. An op-ed dropped, in fact, today in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, written by Brian O'Neill, a retired senior executive from the CIA and National Counterterrorism Center, also an instructor on strategic intelligence here in Atlanta at the Georgia Institute of Technology, a.k.a. Georgia Tech. Spoiler alert, Trump's cuts in intelligence are misguided.
In other news, Trump's expansionist ambitions are back in focus, as President Trump suggested from the Oval Office that Canada be added to the United States as the 51st state of the Union. Reportedly, Canadian officials are opposed to this idea, with the ambassador coming out in what could be characterized as strong opposition.
Here is the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Ray, on CBCNN.
Look, we are definitely not the 51st state. We have no desire, I think the vast majority of Canadians have no desire to become the 51st state. I think the president's musings on that subject have gone on long enough. I mean, we need to move on, develop respectful relationship between our two countries, and come to grips with the fact that when the president and the administration threaten tariffs, that they're really threatening their own economy as much as ours.
President Trump has also suggested within the last 24 hours that the United States, quote, take over Gaza after a horrible war involving tons of casualties and one of the worst human rights crises on the planet. He reportedly wants to replace whatever's in Gaza now with a Riviera. That is a quote. Netanyahu calls it a fresh idea, while other countries repeat their historic opposition to taking in Palestinian refugees from their homeland. Trump suggested that all Palestinians be evacuated from Gaza.
Good news, though, that was just casual. Those were casual remarks and not intended as anything other than speculative inquiries, I was told from a conservative radio host on my own show's Facebook page yesterday. This from NBC News last night.
I'm confident that
with his global megaphone,
the U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip.
President Trump's provocative and volatile vision of an American takeover of war-torn Gaza is roiling the world tonight.
the Riviera of the Middle East.
Yet today, he cited only praise.
Everybody loves it.
But a rare split reaction from the president's party.
I think this is a good development. We have to back Israel 100%. And so whatever form that takes, we're interested in having that discussion.
While other Republicans raise serious doubts.
I'm not supportive of having the American people pay to rebuild Gaza.
Casual, speculative. That's all. Come on, y'all. Can't you take a joke? He was just making a funny. So funny, though, that CNN, same day, lapped it up. Israeli Prime Minister, this is from CNN. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has backed U.S. President Donald Trump's proposal to, quote, take over Gaza, as Israel's army was ordered to prepare plans for large numbers of Palestinians to leave the territory. Trump's plan triggered an enormous backlash with leaders from the Middle East and beyond rejecting it as unworkable and illegal. So much so that the very next day, according to Yahoo News, the Trump administration is walking back the president's proposed intention to remove Palestinians and, quote, take over the Gaza Strip during a press conference with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, saying there is no commitment to putting boots on the ground, but reiterating the need to evacuate the, quote, demolition site. That casual speculative idea that he just sprouted on a dais behind a podium with the presidential seal next to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who himself has shown no regard for things like borders or what land is intended for. I mean, the West Bank has been invaded by Israel. Gaza now bombed into obliteration by Israel. You don't say stuff like that next to Benjamin Netanyahu and not expect him to take it seriously. Hell, it's music to his ears. It's all he needed to hear. And real quick, let me pivot and speak to anyone left of center here, liberals, progressives, those of you who want to finger wag at Muslim American voters who may have sat on the sidelines and not voted for Kamala Harris. And listen, she lost by like 250,000 votes across 3 states. You put together 250,000 votes across 3 swing states, and she would have lost the popular vote and won the Electoral College, which would have been delicious. Nonetheless, we can't just get on to Muslim American voters about this, okay? It's a complex scenario. It really is. I wholeheartily understand their indecisiveness. Yes, they were literally voting for the, I tire of this phrase, the lesser of two evils. And I don't think Kamala Harris was evil. I don't think Joe Biden was evil. But I do think because of political realities, they succumbed to evil. I think Benjamin Netanyahu is evil. I really do. I'm sorry. That doesn't make me anti-Israel. It doesn't make me anti-Semitic. It makes me anti-Benjamin Netanyahu. It makes me pro-two-state solution, which sounds to me like something Donald Trump is dead set against now. And I'm sorry, here's the reality. No two-state solution means a prolonging of Middle Eastern terror. It just does. You cannot ignore the right for there to be an existence of a Palestinian state in some way, shape, form, or fashion and think that Palestinians are just going to roll over. I see so many similarities to what the Native American culture went through in our history and what the Palestinian plight is. And the Palestinians, I mean, they can't not know about Native American history and how it's just, the culture is all but gone. And fear the same. So they're digging in. So when a rich white guy promises a Riviera, a Mar-a-Lago on the shore there, a golf course, they're not for that. And can I just say it's kind of disgusting to even vision something like that, almost literally over the graves of tens of thousands who have been killed just in the last year and a half. It's disgusting. Okay, back to the Georgia State Senate floor. Senator Josh McLaren with his daily Trump news update.
Here with critical commentary on today's news, we have our special guest, the senator from the 14th. Senator from the 14th. Yeah. So I'm trying to remember the campaign messaging. I believe that the vice president and Trump talked a lot about reducing our overseas footprint, not being imperialist and, bringing our boys home and men and women in armed services and focusing on ourselves. But I think what's happened is that Trump has said he wants to either take over or buy Greenland. He's now saying he wants to turn Gaza into another Trump hotel, essentially. And he's basically ignoring the decades of pain and suffering that have occurred in the Middle East and imposing a public policy on that area that's even less wise than Jared Kushner's. It's a pretty remarkable sequence of events. Haven't even brought up the CIA yet, but I guess if you needed to ask what do the CIA and the Gaza takeover and Canada takeover have in common, we have a new foreign policy in the United States that is dumber and more hostile. And we will see where that gets us.
And by the way, let me just call out any of you who were sharing the North Carolina Helene meme. You know, the one with the American flag, the tiny little handheld American flag that was floating in debris water, I guess, after Hurricane Helene, where it said, not one more dime for Ukraine until we see North Carolina rebuilt. North Carolina ain't rebuilt, and yet your guy is talking about investing not just boots on the ground, but American taxpayer dollars to both buy Greenland and rebuild Gaza. Where is your f***ing outrage?
Now, some of you may say, well, you know, Trump needs to be taken figuratively, not literally. Maybe he's just joking around. My question for my colleagues is, does Canada like our jokes? Does Mexico think these jokes are funny?
It ain't funny.
Increasingly, Canada, Mexico, and the rest of the world are unifying in solidarity around just how stupid and hostile America's decisions are, not just to the world's interests, but to its own interests. We do not have rational actors in charge, and every day that we keep allowing this to happen without raising our voices, both Democratic and Republican, this country slides 1 inch closer to idiocracy and fascism.
Oh, we're there.
Not an overstatement. Well, that's all the time we have for our special guest, and it's all the time we have for Trump Morning News. As always, we remind you, your state legislators, there's nothing you can do directly about this, and there is nothing the Republican Party could have done in the last 20 years to prevent this from happening. Right. Thank you for your time.
I love that he signs off with that, because there's a lot that could have happened in the last 20 years that the GOP could have done to have kept us on the rails. You know, we could have had the impeachment vote, Mitch McConnell, after January 6th, the one that the nation would have not batted an eyelash over and said, no, that needed to happen. You had almost near universal, you had a consensus anyway, in both the Republican and Democratic parties in Congress to do something about that at that point in time, and Mitch McConnell was hesitant. We could have, I don't know, sat a Supreme Court justice, that was President Barack Obama's right to nominate, but you didn't do that. And listen, in hindsight, I'm no Merrick Garland fan, but we would have had a 5-4 court, still a conservative majority, and closer anyway to representing the even split that this nation sits at right now. Mitch McConnell, who was on 60 Minutes, and they did their damnedest to try and gloss over all that he is responsible for in putting us in the position that we're in right now as a nation, with this rogue madman leading us and the MAGA oligarchy running things, Elon Musk completely having infiltrated Treasury and now moving into our health care, so that not only is Grandpa's Social Security check endangered, now Medicare payouts are as well. You think our healthcare system is fraught with peril now? Oh, just you wait. And by the way, Senator John F. Kennedy, who was presiding over the Georgia State Senate yesterday, you could tell he didn't really care much for this anymore. It wasn't funny to him anymore. It's not lighthearted anymore, or is it?
All right, that's our morning entertainment, if that's what that was. But Senator from the second, if you'd like to follow that, it's your turn for a point of personal privilege.
Listen, Senator Kennedy, maybe dial back the snark a little bit, because Senator Malau's about to bring some realness to you, buddy.
Thank you, Mr. President. This morning I had to bring the news up I-16, and I don't have Trump morning news, but I do have news from my small business owners that happen to live in Chatham County and in the city of Savannah that depend on fabric, material, and other parcels that happen to come from China. Last night they received notification that there would be a suspension of all inbound parcels from China and Hong Kong. There was no advance notification that their products would be delayed. They have taken orders. I have a bridal business that basically had to email clients this morning that she was going to have to delay their wedding dresses because she will not receive the materials in time to complete the job. Mm-hmm. Now, this may not seem like a big issue to y'all, but this is about small business. And you can't plan and run a business when you don't know what is about to happen next. To receive an email from the United States Postal Service informing you that they will not have any more inbound parcels from China or Hong Kong, and you're a small business owner, you didn't have an opportunity to plan or prepare. And I am from a little rural city outside of Savannah, a little town called Pinpoint. It's a Gullah Geechee community. And my grandmother would say, year after year. You can shear a sheep year after year, but you can only skin his behind once. And so with all that's going on, if you start affecting small businesses, you have a moral obligation to say something, because when folks don't have an opportunity to plan and you start putting folks out of business because your policy is working for big corporations and not the small business owners, then we have a huge problem. And with that, Mr. President, I take this news back down to I-16 and I yield the well.
Trump's policies creating real havoc for small businesses in Georgia and throughout the rest of the United States. By the way, the U.S. Postal Service now is letting your Shine and Temu shipments come in from China again. So that was just a temporary thing for now, I guess. Good news, though. The 10 to 15, maybe, total high school and college trans participants in athletic sports are now no longer allowed, thanks to an executive order by the president. That is a problem he really needed to just right away. We'll get to that when the Ron Show returns. America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn. You can follow the Ron Show on your preferred social media platforms at Ron Show ATL. Twitter, X, Instagram, not even Meta, Facebook. No. I've been on those way too long. Blue Sky, yeah, all over that. Threads, did I mention them all? At Ron Show ATL. Last night.
Under the Trump administration, we will defend the proud tradition of female athletes, and we will not allow men to beat up, injure, and cheat our women and our girls. From now on, women's sports will be only for women. With my action this afternoon, we're putting every school receiving taxpayer dollars on notice that if you let men take over women's sports teams or invade your locker rooms.
Oh, let me stop right there. Let's go to Now This Impact.
Donald Trump loves a beauty pageant, and by his own admission, he was no stranger backstage while owning parts of 3 different pageants for nearly 2 decades.
You know, they're standing there with no clue. Is everybody okay? And you see these incredible looking women. And so I sort of get away with things like that.
In 2001, Tasha Dixon was Miss Arizona, competing in the Miss USA pageant. She experienced this kind of awkward moment firsthand.
Our first introduction to him was when we were at the dress rehearsal and half naked changing into our bikinis.
Dixon was 18 at the time and says watching Trump storm into a dressing room was shocking.
I'll go backstage before a show. Yes. And everyone's getting dressed and ready and everything else. And, you know, no men are anywhere. And I'm allowed to go in because I'm the owner of the pageant, and therefore I'm inspecting it.
And if anybody knows predatory behavior, it's a predator, right?
You will be investigated for violations of Title IX and risk your federal funding. There will be no federal funding.
Senator Dick Durbin 2 months ago questioning NCAA President Charlie Baker.
How many athletes are there in the United States in NCAA schools?
510,000.
How many transgender athletes are you aware of?
Less than 10.
Okay, Ron, but what about high school? Save Women's Sports, according to Newsweek, a leading voice in the bid to ban transgender athletes from competing in girls' sports, identified only 5 transgender athletes competing on girls' teams in school sports for grades K through 12. 5. Not 5,000 or 500 or even 50. Just 5.
I'm also directing our Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, to deny any and all visa applications made by men attempting to fraudulently enter the United States while identifying themselves as women athletes to try and get into the games.
That's kind of a big deal because the 2028 Summer Olympic Games are being held in Los Angeles, California, July 14th through July 30th, well ahead of the 2028 presidential election, or before the next president is even sworn in.
And last week, I effectively banned the chemical castration and surgical mutilation of minor children.
There again, a solution in search of a problem when the overwhelming majority of surgeries of that kind do not occur before the age of 18 already. And that's a global practice adhered to in the United States. They don't care about kids, though. If they did, they would care about all kids, even kids who identify as non-binary or trans. But Nancy Mace cannot be helped. And Representative Gerald Connolly from Virginia pointed that out at a House Oversight Committee hearing just yesterday.
The gentlelady has used a phrase that is considered a slur in the LGBTQ community and the transgender community And let me please finish without interruption.
Of course not.
And
Tranny. I don't really care. You want penises in women's bathrooms, and I'm not going to have it.
Okay.
No, thank you.
Let
It's disgusting.
let the gentleman state his parliamentary inquiry.
to me, a slur is a slur.
Right.
And here in the committee, a level of decorum requires us to try consciously to avoid slurs. You just heard the gentlelady actually actively, robustly repeat it. And I would just ask the chairman that she be counseled that we ought not to be engaged. We can have debate and policy discussion without offending human beings who are our fellow citizens. And so I would ask, as a parliamentary inquiry, whether the use of that phrase is not, in fact, a violation of the decorum rules.
He then got cut off by DEI candidate, Citadel graduate, Representative Nancy Mace, who didn't want to be mansplained to by Jerry Connolly or the chairman of the Oversight Committee, James Comer, who admitted to not being up to date on political correctness. Big surprise.
Follow The Ron Show on Facebook at The Ron Show Radio. The Ron Show on America One Radio.
Surely I've said this before, right? The evil genius of conservatism since the Reagan era, when he was the one that famously said, you know, government is not here to solve your problems, government is the problems, is that they are sort of a self-fulfilling prophetic machine here. They tell you that government is inefficient and can't do what they've been tasked to do, and wink, wink, look to the private sector instead, while continuing to gut government agencies to make them less efficient and infuriating to those of us who go anywhere like, I don't know, scheduling something with the IRS or even just your state DMV. Yeah, it trickles on down to the state level as well. That your agencies are so understaffed and outmanned and underfunded and lacking in equipment that, yes, they do fail to live up to the expectations because they've been starved by the politicians who tell you that they are inefficient and aren't there to help you and won't be able to help you. I want to share some data that comes from the Federal Salary Council Working Group, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, and the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO. There is this misconception, I believe, that there's this huge federal government bureaucracy that is watching our... It's actually happening now with Elon Musk and his teen boys infiltrating these various federal agencies with artificial intelligence. Do you trust people or do you trust artificial intelligence? It's a valid question, right? Here are some stats that I think need to be brought into the conversation. Federal employees are just 1.87% of the American workforce. Did you hear that? 1.87% of the American workforce. That's prior to these buyouts, and what are we at, 40,000 a day? I think they wanted, it's like maybe 2% of the federal workforce. They are trying to get it to be 5 to 10% by midnight tonight. 1.87% of the entire American workforce, federal employee. 4.3% of the federal budget amounts to federal workforce compensation. Just 4% of the federal budget. The ratio of federal workers to national population has steadily decreased for more than half a century. Gee, well, who was it that was being elected and sworn into office about half a century ago and started talking about government being the problem instead of being there to... Oh, that's right. St. Reagan the Infallible. And listen, that ratio has been steadily decreasing even with the largest expansion of federal governance that occurred under liberal, progressive, socialist George W. Bush. Well, that doesn't jibe. Yeah, Homeland Security. Largest growth of federal governance in the last 50 years. And still, the ratio of federal workers to national population has decreased for more than half a century. Federal employees are paid 25% less compared to private sector counterpoints. I think I pointed that out. Only 10% of the federal employees are fully remote, by the way. This push to have them all come back to work like in office, adding to the gridlock wherever they do work. Only 10% of federal employees are fully remote. 79.4% of federal working hours are spent at an in-person workspace. 79.4%. 1 out of 3 federal employees is a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces. Support the troops! Take care of our veterans! 1 out of 3 federal employees is a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces. So when you're sitting here cheering on and enjoying the dogeism of fellow employees, those lifetime bureaucrats, suddenly finding themselves hand-wringing about how they're going to pay their bills because they're trying to decide, do they take the buyout and get paid through September or find themselves unemployed. 1 out of 3 of those are veterans of the U.S. Armed Forces. And despite making 25% less compared to private sector counterparts, federal employees are actually more educated. They're 53% more likely to have at least a bachelor's degree. And 120%, more than twice, 120% as likely to have an advanced degree than private sector workers, their private sector counterparts. These are facts that we don't hear enough of. And by the way, since again I got these sources from OMB, OPM, and the CBO, this data is going away. I mean, they're literally putting this stuff out of reach and out of sight, trying to bury or rewrite history or statistics or data so that you won't have access to this. I am not one of those people who is an alarmist and tells you to back everything up on a flash drive and hide the flash drive. I don't post the disclaimers on my social media profiles that you constantly see people getting baited into pasting. The alarmist stuff, I just don't. But I did save this one. I mean, it's on my phone, so Apple could come and get it, I guess. AT&T could come and get it. I'm paying for cloud service. So maybe it gets unalived or disappears. I don't know. But I don't forget stuff like this. You heard me say this just the other day. And I literally sometimes pull statistics that I've just seen ad nauseum over and over and over again. I do. I pull them out of my ass because I know them. I know them by heart. Federal employees are paid 25% less compared to private sector counterparts. I've known that. I've known that. In fact, this data is not on here, on this graph, which I guess I could share. I don't know if I can share it to Instagram because it's kind of a long, tall graph, but I can put it on Facebook. I'll put it at Ron Show ATL on Facebook. I also know that, and I think this is important. I think this is one of the things that fuels this anti-government push. I know that the federal workforce is vastly browner than the U.S. population. Don't think that that's just a coincidence at all. And by the way, the latest target is the Department of Education, which Jimmy Carter established back in the 1970s. He established the Department of Education because we had 50 wholly disparate departments of education or educational systems in this country teaching a variety of different things. There has to be some sort of a consensus, right? I'm going to remind you of an article that came out in 2021. Michael Harriot wrote it in The Root. I'll include it in the show notes at ronshowatl.com. Headline, we found the textbooks of senators who oppose the 1619 Project. CRT. American history. And suddenly everything makes sense, the headline says. White people love critical race theories. Michael Harriot begins this article writing, while they generally oppose critical race theory, the academic movement started by black scholars, they have historically embraced the uncapitalized version of race theory. However, because so many see whiteness as a default, they don't understand that their entire education has already been racialized. The fact that most people know about Betsy Ross' amazing ability to sew or Paul Revere's talent for writing and yelling, but have never heard of Mary Ellen Pleasant or Colonel Ty, is proof that the American education system is filtered through the lens of whiteness, Harriet writes. So when Mitch McConnell and 38 Republican senators sent a letter to the Secretary of Education decrying the ghastly prospect of white students having to learn actual facts about slavery, eek, it was not unexpected. For centuries, this country's schools, Harriet writes, have perpetuated a whitewashed version of history that either erases or reduces the story of Black America down to a B-plot in the American script. It's why they hate critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and anything factual, because the white-centric interpretation of our national past is so commonly accepted. White people have convinced themselves that anything that varies from the Caucasian interpretation must be a lie. So then the piece goes into what each of the senators who oppose critical race theory were actually learning when they were in school. Marsha Blackburn, senator from Tennessee. She grew up attending elementary and high school in Laurel, Mississippi. In 1959, they write, the year Senator Marsha Blackburn would have entered kindergarten in Mississippi, the state legislation handed control of choosing textbooks to Governor Ross Barnett. At the request of the Mississippi State Society of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the state had already mandated a 9th grade course in Mississippi history, which means Blackburn learned the history of her state from John K. Bettersworth's textbook, Mississippi, A History. The New York Times wrote in 1979 that Bettersworth's catalog, quote, treats blacks of old as complacent darkies or as a problem to whites. When the Root reviewed the text, we noticed, they write, Harriet writes, that the entire history of the 250-year institution of slavery was reduced to 5 pages. Bettersworth's book was based on Daughters of the Confederacy propaganda that taught children that the slave master treated his slaves as his own, but noted that most of the human chattel were so lazy that, quote, it took 2 to help, 1 to do nothing. However, Bettersworth was sure to point out the kindness of the masters who educated the enslaved, quote, as they taught their own children. Mississippi, A History also treats the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education case as a travesty, insisting that Mississippians were largely satisfied with the segregated schools. Quote, incidents had been extremely rare, it explained, for by and large each race, its parents, its pupils, and their teachers had found it advantageous to remain in equal but separate status. But by the way, this is not just an old people pre-integration. And yes, by the way, Marsha Blackburn graduated before her high school was integrated thing. This is not just an old people thing. Tom Cotton, a 1995 graduate of Dardanelle High School, likely learned his American history from The American Pageant, from a publishing company called Sencage. Sencage is a relative newcomer in the textbook industry. Its high school history book, The American Pageant, was used across the country for many years. The text is nuanced and thorough, even in how it presents slavery most of the time. One of the realities of the textbook industry, Harriet writes, is because of the UDC's influence over school districts and boards of education in the South, publishers must choose between telling the truth or bowing out of the textbook market in one quarter of the country. Tom Cotton's text never explicitly says the Civil War was about slavery or even refers to it as a civil war. Instead, it carefully couches the, quote, war for Southern independence as a class that had to do with tariffs, Northern overreach, blah, blah, blah. The book also doesn't quote any of the actual declarations of secession, only noting that the, quote, rebel Jefferson Davis told the despotic king, Abraham Lincoln, all we ask is to be let alone. And of course, the textbook describes the period after the Civil War this way. Unbending loyalty to, quote, Old Massa prompted many slaves to help their owners resist the Union armies. Blacks blocked the door to the, quote, big house with their bodies, or stashed the plantation silverware under mattresses in their own humble huts, where it would be safe from the plundering bluebellies. Newly emancipated slaves sometimes eagerly accepted the invitation of Union troops to join in the pillaging of their master's possessions. This would be a theme throughout many of the textbooks, Harriet writes, continuing on to show you what folks like Ted Cruz read. Ted Cruz attended a private Christian academy for his entire educational career, so they could not verify the specific book used by Cruz Elementary School to teach Texas history. However, his advanced placement U.S. history class required in Second Baptist High School's curriculum likely used the 8th edition of The American Pageant, which contained most of the same passages outlined earlier. Skipping on down, Senator Lindsey Graham, South Carolina, what he read. Although Brown v. Board of Education officially outlawed segregation in 1955, Lindsey Graham's school district in Pickens County, South Carolina, didn't desegregate until 1970. So it's understandable why he learned history from the History of South Carolina, published from 1840 until 1970 by 3 generations of descendants of pro-Confederate William Sims. While Sims' early versions opined about the, quote, irresponsible, uneducated unmoral, and in many cases brutish Africans, Graham likely used the 1958 edition, where Mary C. Sims, Oliphant, Sims' granddaughter, had a much more progressive view. Get a load of this. Most masters treated their slaves kindly, wrote Oliphant. Africans were brought from a worse life to a better one. As slaves, they were trained in the ways of civilization. Above all, the landowners argued, the slaves were given the opportunity to become Christians in a Christian land instead of remaining heathens in a savage country. John Kennedy, Republican senator, Louisiana, graduated from Zachary High School in 1969, which did not integrate until the year after. They tracked down a copy of the 1952 edition of Louisiana, a History used by 1968 Northwestern graduate Ella Mae Bowery, who got that book handed down to her, like many black students did, from Zachary High School. Said of slavery, Louisiana slaves were amongst the happiest and most content. There were very few insurrections because being enslaved in the bordering states of Arkansas, Mississippi, and Texas was a wholly undesirable prospect. Mitch McConnell, from age 8 until he was 12, McConnell attending schools in Augusta, Georgia, which means he was required to take a class on Georgia history in the 3rd or 4th grade using the textbook Our Georgia, which Melton McLaren describes this way. The authors of Our Georgia find a solution to the first problem of racial imagery confronted by any writer dealing with Southern history, the institution of slavery. Since slavery in Anglo-Saxon societies was based on race, and since antebellum Southern society was based on slavery, their solution is rather unique. They ignore the issue as much as possible. Eli Whitney sees Negroes picking seed out of cotton while singing, of course. Joel Chandler Harris writes stories of slaves who are also musically inclined. Frank Lebby Stanton writes poems in Negro dialect. That is the extent of the text's treatment of slavery indeed. That is all the text says about the Negro. The word slave is used in the book 5 times, the word Negro only 5. There is, however, an entire chapter on the Indians of Georgia and numerous references to them elsewhere in the book. The role of the Negro since the antebellum period is completely ignored. No attention is given to any of the social problems caused by the growing Negro militancy of the late 1940s or early 1950s, or the problem race presented in education, although education in modern Georgia is discussed. Not one single contribution to the state of Georgia by one single Negro is considered. The color line does not exist. After moving to Louisville, Kentucky and attending DuPont Manual High School, McConnell would have learned from an education department that provides grants in Kentucky Education Television for Kentucky Story, which still teaches this about slavery in Kentucky. Are you ready for this? Because many owners and servants worked side by side or had frequent contact, the bond between them was more patriarchal than was the relationship shared by slaves and masters in other states. They all brag about how much better being enslaved in that state was in another state. This is crazy talk, right? While exceptions can be noted, it is generally believed that Kentucky slaves experienced a less harsh life than did those living elsewhere. Did they take a survey? Many aspects of the slaves' lives resembled those of white laborers. In addition to these evening and Sunday activities, masters encouraged their chattels to engage in recreational activities, such as dancing and singing, that provided emotional release. Happy slaves worked better than discontented ones. Religion also played an important role in the slaves' existence and enslavement. Churches encouraged masters to treat their people kindly and urged slaves to be good Christians, to serve their earthly masters as they would their heavenly Father, and to look for rewards in the hereafter for services rendered on earth. The Department of Education got rid of textbooks like that. And that's why Republicans want to get rid of the Department of Education, so that textbooks like that can come back. Final few moments of today's Ron Show. I did mention at the start of the show I was going to dive into an op-ed written by a former CIA executive, guest lecturer at Georgia Tech and Georgia State, Brian O'Neill. That appears in today's Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'll give it to you today in the show notes at ronshowatl.com, but I'm actually trying to get him on the show, so hang on to that a little bit. I'll get you a little nugget here. The Trump administration trying to buy out as much of the federal workforce as they can, hoping to hit 5 to 10% target. Right now they're at about 2% by midnight tonight. Doesn't look like they'll get much further than that. Anyway, O'Neill writes, behind this initiative lies the Trump administration's ongoing effort to shrink the federal workforce, initially launched as a government-wide effort and now entering a 2.0 phase, one in which national security organizations are not exempt. O'Neill writes, the inclusion of the intelligence community in this endeavor shows little understanding of, or perhaps no regard for, how intelligence agencies operate or how strategic continuity is maintained. This paragraph sends chills. The assumption underlying CIA's deferred resignation policy is that ineffective personnel will self-select for departure. Yet those who truly do not contribute effectively to mission success are often the most likely to stay, either because they do not perceive their shortcomings or because they lack better options. Meanwhile, high performers who are keenly aware of their value and have lucrative private sector opportunities are more likely to take the offer and leave. This dynamic risks creating the opposite of what the policy intends, a drain on talent and institutional knowledge while supposed underperformers remain entrenched. In the CIA, y'all. Again, I'm going to try to have Brian O'Neill on to discuss this further at some point in time. In the meanwhile, the definitely not anti-gay, but very pro-business Trump administration causing some headaches in the business community. Well, the gay business community. Take a listen to this from WAGA Fox 5 TV in Atlanta.
New at 10, organizers of an LGBTQ networking event at the Federal Reserve of Atlanta say they won't be welcome back this year.
That is in keeping with an executive order from President Trump banning any federal endorsement of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Fox News' Rob DiRienzo is at the live desk tonight to break down all this for us. Rob?
Hey there, guys. Good evening to you both. Well, President Donald Trump has made it very clear there is no more DEI in the federal government. Here in Atlanta, the Out Georgia Business Alliance says that's left them in a tough spot.
This from Acting Executive Director Andy Monroe.
We're in a position where we're trying to figure out how to host about 200 people.
The Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta has hosted the annual LGBT Economic Inclusion Summit for a couple years.
Full transparency, I attended that summit 2 years ago, as a matter of fact, as a member of the Out Georgia Business Alliance.
Now that appears to have ended with the Trump administration.
So what does this pause mean? It means no more funding for illegal DEI programs. It means no more funding for transgenderism and wokeness across our federal bureaucracy and agencies.
That would be the White House version of Cruella de Vil spokesperson Carolyn with a K Levitt. Incidentally, Out Georgia wasn't being funded by the Biden administration or any administration that I'm aware of. Just using a facility that happens to be owned by the federal government. And paying for it, by the way.
The Greater Houston LGBTQ plus Chamber of Commerce abruptly had to relocate in late January for the same reason. The interim director of the Out Georgia Business Alliance says they've been around for decades, and this event is geared toward empowerment and networking.
The changes feel very heavy. There's a really somber tone throughout the community.
A spokesperson for the Atlanta Fed tells Fox 5 they're, quote, looking at all scheduled events to ensure we are appropriately aligned with the Trump administration's executive order as well as with existing policies and applicable laws.
0.9% of members of our community are in Fortune 500 boardrooms. To say that their American dream is something that is outside of national concern is greatly concerning as a citizen.
And Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic became the first black and openly gay president of the regional federal bank when he was appointed in 2017, and that was during the first Trump administration. At the live desk, Rob DiRienzo, Fox 5 News.
Congratulations, MAGA gays or relatives of the LGBTQ plus that voted for Donald Trump. You just ensured 4 years of your loved ones or yourself being treated as a second-class citizen by this administration. This isn't a case of the LGBs rooting against the Ts or being pulled away from the community overall to root against the Ts. No, this is all of us. We're all in this boat together, and now we're all second-class citizens. What other federal institutions or facilities are we now not going to be allowed to make use of as tax-paying citizens of this country? 1,443 more days of this bullshit to contend with. That is going to do it for today's Ron Show. I see that my music is, there it is, about to queue up. The show airs weekdays, 9 a.m., 5 p.m. on America One Radio, 11 p.m. Progressive Voices via TuneIn, and wherever you podcast. Show notes, anything you hear me read, audio I get, I provide the sources. I cite my sources. Miss Vaught back in 5th grade would love me. Those can be found at ronshowatl.com. Have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow.